I'm now very happy to turn things over to Dr. David King, who is an instructor in the UBC Department of Psychology, leading courses in personality psychology, health psychology, and the psychology of sex and gender. He's the author of 2 undergraduate textbooks and multiple publications in peer-reviewed journal. I'm now very happy to turn things over to Dr. King with today's talk on vaccine hesitancy, conspiracy theories, and political extremism. I'll turn things over to Dr. King.
Great, thank you. So before I get into our discussion today, I'll just tell you a little bit more about my background. In terms of my research experience, it's been pretty diverse over the years. It actually started in the area of dreams and dreaming, but it's come a long way. And for the most part, my work over the last decade or so is focused on stress and coping. And one of the things I'm really interested in is how people make sense of the world around them. That's a pretty big topic in itself, but what's included in that is how people overcome adversity, how they deal with difficulties like trauma, and how they make sense of the world, how they find meaning and purpose, and also how they find a sense of order in things. And I think that topic is quite relevant to what we'll be talking about today, since these various sources of social division really do result in a lot of ways from attempts to make sense of the world. Most of my time recently, although I'm still involved in research, does focus on teaching. And I would say that across all of my courses, one of my favorite things to do as an instructor is to really help connect the dots for people and help to try to reveal to them what the bigger picture looks like, drawing connections between things that maybe aren't always obvious to people. So that's something else that I really hope to do today. In fact, what I really want to do is leave you with a framework that you can use and apply to understanding human behavior more broadly in your everyday life, as well as out there in the world, in what you're seeing in the news and the media. It's a pretty valuable and insightful framework. At least I've felt that way about it for some time, so I hope you do too. So let me just share my screen here and we'll get started. All right. So I have the title here, from vaccine hesitancy to conspiracy theories and political extremism. I realize that that seems like a lot to cover. We're not going to get into the nuances and the details of each of these movements, although we will talk about each of them on their own at different points. Again, what my goal is today is to really provide you with a framework for understanding all of these things. And I hope to show you that there is an underlying theme, a couple of themes that can really provide a lot of further insight and understanding as to what we're really dealing with today. So the second part of the title here is, why do we see the world the way we do? I guess, perhaps more accurately, the title should be, why do some people see the world in such extreme ways? All right. I don't think that it would be a stretch to propose to you, to suggest to you that we seem more divided than ever. Whether it is in the anti-vax movement, which is still holding on today and affecting even how people respond to the COVID vaccination program, to the anti-mask protests that we're seeing even in Canadian cities, or COVID denialism in general. And I'm not even sure that I understand exactly what that is all about, but it still is relevant to our discussion. Then we also see a number of different conspiracy theories, some of them quite extreme. Some of you may have heard a lot about QAnon lately, which is not entirely isolated to the United States. We're actually seeing some Canadian support for this conspiracy theory, and it's a pretty extreme one. We see a belief in this elitist, the secret cabal of leftist elitists who are running a worldwide child sex trafficking ring, and to top it off, they're also apparently cannibalistic. And this, despite how outlandish it is something that has continued to gain momentum, even in the face of many of their predictions being proven false in the last couple of years. We also see then more tame conspiracy theories like the flat earth conspiracy theory, where individuals believe that the world is flat and surrounded by an ice wall, and that ice wall is protected and patrolled by NASA soldiers. And, it just goes on from there. Okay? Now, some of these groups, unfortunately, are also responsible for various acts of violence and aggression. And that's where we see the sort of more extreme end of all of this, where a lot of individuals who have these unique perspectives on the world, they act out in violence and aggression quite frequently. and cause a lot of social disruption. So we see that in groups like the alt-right, which is in many ways another iteration of white supremacy today, other far-right nationalist groups. Another example might be the Proud Boys, a group that was actually started by a Canadian, and they are not only nationalistic, but they also describe themselves as Western chauvinists. They believe in a superior position of men in society and in the home, and they, very frequently espouse, racist, sexist rhetoric, and they've also been responsible for acts of violence themselves. These are just some examples that have come up recently in the media. There are many others like climate change denialism, and we will try to touch on some of those as well. So the question that I'm going to try to answer for you here is a pretty big one, and that is why? And why are we so divided in these ways? And why is it that division may be growing? Statistically speaking, we actually see that membership in these groups has been growing in the last few years, even in Canada. So there's something to be said for this idea that it's on the rise. Well, before we get into my answers to this question of why, I want to remind you of a really important truth in psychology, and that is that human behavior is always complicated. Now, that on its surface seems pretty obvious, and you would probably agree with that conclusion. But more importantly, it is complicated because it is always the result of an interaction between the individual and things in the environment. Okay? And we can never entirely tease those things apart. And as much as we would like to believe that we are always in control of every situation that we find ourselves in, the reality is we know from decades of research that the situation matters, our environment matters. Okay? And that's always, always the case. And so that also means then that there are a number of factors that we would always ideally want to acknowledge, but we can never fully account for absolutely everything. Okay? And so my goal today is not to try to explain every aspect, every factor of these different social movements, but instead to focus on a few that are particularly relevant and I think insightful. So on that note, I'm going to propose to you today that there are three main forces that play a pivotal role in our lives, generally speaking, but also importantly in the social division that we see today. Okay, so I've described these forces as the forces that rule us. Sounds a little dramatic, but I would argue that they're actually that important that we can understand them to be playing a role in pretty much everything. The first two are what we call the big two in a lot of psychological literature, and they're essentially human motives. So they're these big two motives, and they're called agency and communion. So I want you to keep these two terms in mind. I'll be bringing them up throughout the discussion today. Agency is the motive to get ahead. So this is all about being an individual, right? Being assertive, being in control, demonstrating your competence and your power as an individual. And then along with that is also this tendency to have to stand out, feel special, and feel unique. Okay? Communion, on the other hand, is the motive to get along and engage in relationships, to connect with other people, to sort of experience social harmony and reciprocity, to essentially be part of the group. And along with that, obviously, there are a lot of different behaviors that are important to that kind of social harmony, like warmth, empathy, compassion, and morality. Now, these two things are not opposite. They can exist together in balance, all right? And both have obviously played very important roles in our evolutionary history, which is why they remain within us as these innate motives, these innate drives, okay, that have an influence on behavior. So they're not opposite, but they can sometimes get a little out of balance. And that's really what is relevant to our talk today. The third force is fear. And we'll get into that in a little while, but it has an interesting impact on these big two motives. And in particular, it has an impact on agency. And you'll see how that sort of fits into our discussion. So we will get to that. All right. So agency and communion offer us this really amazing framework for understanding a variety of different concepts and ideas in psychology. They essentially offer us this excellent perspective on human behavior. They're a very broad and overarching framework. And so the reality is that depending on where we look in the world, or depending on what kind of human behavior we look at, we actually see that agency and communion express themselves, they manifest in many different ways. So we can understand all of these things that you see underneath each of these two motives as being different manifestations or different expressions of these fundamental human drives. Agency is power and dominance and control. Sometimes is expressed as pride. It's a concern for status and independence. We also see it arise in competition. At the higher end, we might see it, result in aggression or even narcissism, where, in that trait in particular, we're looking at this extreme focus on the self to the exclusion of others. All right. It also manifests in traditional definitions of masculinity, individualism as a cultural orientation, and that is largely characteristic of Western societies like our own, where we care a lot about how we stand out, how we may appear as unique within the group. And then it also interestingly aligns with conservative political values, where there's more concern for individual power and control, and less concern for social welfare programs. Now, communion, on the other hand, in many ways is the opposite of these things, right? It involves cooperation and empathy, and importantly as well, humility. It also aligns with traditional notions of femininity and cultural orientation of collectivism. So it's more characteristic of Eastern cultures, where individuals really see themselves as embedded in the group. Their self-concept is not the same as ours. They see themselves as really part of that social fabric. And then communion also aligns with liberal political values, right? Where we see a concern for social welfare programs and equality. Now, I will say that in every case, it's not always a perfect fit, but these things definitely run parallel to agency and communion, right? So one of the first things that I want to point out about agency and communion is that they help us to understand the differences that exist among us. There are many, many different traits on which people differ naturally as a result of their biology and their environment. And the reality is that we are different in terms of our agentic and communal drives. They're just these natural differences that exist among us. Some of us are sort of perfectly balanced in each case. Some of us are more driven by agency. Some of us are more concerned with our power and our status and how we stand out. Others are more communally inclined. Okay? We care more about our relationships. And as you might imagine, if you think about a social situation where you have someone who's highly, highly agentic, very much concerned about their power and status and dominance, and then you have someone else who's far more communally inclined, you might see that depending on the situation, those two individuals may actually have a difficult time getting along. Because ultimately, these motives also result in different perspectives on the world itself. Right? A communally inclined person naturally has more concerns for relationships and for things like empathy and compassion. A person high in agency is not going to be as concerned with those things, and they're going to be looking out for themselves. So this alone helps to explain why we are so often divided today. Right? We look at sorry, Mark. If we look at different sources of social division today, we see that very often that division arises from this incongruence, okay, between agency and communion. But I want to propose something else to you, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest this, and that is that we see evidence that agency is on the rise today. And this is largely, it is assumed anyway, that it is largely due to the fact that we live in an increasingly individualistic society. Okay? In the psychological research that's relevant to this, we see evidence of increasing individualism around the world, increasing narcissism, increasing materialism and consumerism, and importantly, declining empathy and perspective taking. And what's likely happening here is that our sense of agency, for a variety of different reasons that I'd be happy to talk about after the lecture, for some reason we're seeing our sense of agency be exaggerated in what we would actually call an unmitigated expression of agency. Unmitigated agency is when agency is very, very high, and communion as a result is naturally suppressed. As you might imagine, the more and more you focus on yourself, the less you're going to be able to think about other people. Okay? And so when these things become out of balance, they sort of diverge in very problematic ways. Okay. And there are a lot of different reasons that we can talk about here, like the use of social media, even economic development appears to be tied to rising individualism. But this is what I am suggesting to you is the underlying problem with all of these different sources of social division today. And depending on exactly how we can look at it, it provides us with a lot of insight into exactly what is happening. So we're going to take a look at a variety of different manifestations of this agency rising, and we're going to tie those different manifestations to these different sources of social division. And the first thing I want to point out that is associated with this unmitigated agency in modern society is this need to feel special. And this, in some ways, is probably the least problematic outcome of an unmitigated agency, but it is still problematic nonetheless. And interestingly, if we start the discussion with a consideration of conspiracy theories like flat Earth, we see that in the psychological research, there is evidence that people believe in these conspiracy theories specifically in order to feel special and unique. What are the kinds of thoughts that are probably going through individuals' heads? Well, this idea that they've figured something out that other people haven't, right? I get something that other people don't get. I know something that other people don't know. And that alone is an expression of that individual agency, okay? That power, that competence. And furthermore, this idea of then being part of a group that has also figured that out and that makes the person feel special for that knowledge that they've stumbled upon. So this alone is a really valuable source of insight in terms of understanding how individualistic society, where agency is exaggerated, results in more support for conspiracy theories. We also see that groups like Proud Boys, Incels, involuntary celibates, it's an online subculture for those who aren't familiar that has also been responsible for some very serious violent acts. And even QAnon followers, they're all driven by needs for identity, recognition, and esteem. Regardless of how dangerous they may be, they're all driven by these same needs. Okay. We also see very much closely associated with that, we see the need to have a voice, okay, and the need to be heard, and then this tendency to know better, this need to know better than everyone else. And we see this in our narcissistic leaders, where there's an assumption made about climate change, despite not having any scientific research or evidence to back it up. This idea that you can sort of solve the climate change debate by sitting in your living room, that's obviously inherently problematic. Or different beliefs that people come up with regarding the current pandemic. Again, based on just sort of their own impression of things, they feel like they can figure it all out, despite not having done any scientific research or even being scientists themselves. Another expression of that unmitigated agency. This also then comes along with this need to be right. And I would argue pretty much all of the time, when agency is high in the research, we see that narcissism is high, egos are inflated, and there's a persistent lack of humility. Right? This idea that an individual may be able to know better than thousands of scientists, right? Or that one's own impression of the world is more valuable than that of experts who have actually done research and spent years studying a particular area. That persistent lack of humility is also the result of that highly individualistic society that we live in. Right? And the reality is that being proven wrong and being humble, those are signs of weakness in an individualistic society. So there's no acceptance of those behaviors. Flat earthers are a really good example here again, okay? Because what's really interesting about this group is they have employed their own quasi-scientific methods to try to prove that the earth is flat. And every time they keep proving that the earth actually has curvature. But every time that they do that, they blatantly refuse to accept what they find. In fact, they even try to hide the findings from many of their members. And they often insist that something must have gone wrong with their experiment. Okay? We also see that individualism and narcissism in the psychological research are correlated with anti-vaccine attitudes and defiance of health precautions, even in the pandemic that we're in now, like wearing a mask. And that really comes down to this important need to always be right. When it comes to anti-vaxxers, they've adopted those attitudes and those beliefs, and they can't be proven wrong, because in an individualistic society, again, that would be seen as a weakness. So there's this persistence of these beliefs that happens as a result of this need to be right all of the time. Now, this also then all comes along with this need to react. And often that reactivity is aggressive. When we see narcissism at a very high level, and also when we look at a hyper individualistic culture like the United States being a good example, we see that there is this tendency to be reactive. Any threat to one's own perspective or worldview, anything that's perceived in that way is met with aggression and violence, this very reactionary kind of response. Now, in the research, we can go back to the anti-vaccine movement and even some of the resistance to COVID health precautions. And we see that reactance, which is specifically a low tolerance for anything that is perceived as an infringement on one's own freedoms, We see that that is associated with the anti-vax movement and resistance to other health precautions during the current pandemic. People don't want to accept that they may have lost any control, and they perceive any suggestion from the government as some kind of infringement on their rights and freedoms. It's a hypersensitivity that is not grounded in rationality, but again, it's a result of a hyperindividualism. We also see obviously very reactionary forms of violence and aggression from the alt-right and other far-right nationalist groups. Okay? They're known for those behaviors. This is also closely related to the need for power and status. And ultimately, expressions of dominance and power, perhaps the most problematic outcomes of this unmitigated agency, they're also much more characteristic of a hyper-individualistic social context. Obviously, when we look at the Proud Boys again, as I noted already, they're a nationalist extremist group, very anti-immigrant, very misogynistic. They glorify violence, or at least many of their members do, and they're also inherently racist. Many describe them as ultimately, again, some other iteration of white supremacy in some form, although they have interestingly admitted a few members of color, but that's a sort of a complicated discussion to get into at this point. And then we can also look at followers of QAnon. There's also this new group in the US that refers to themselves as the Oath Keepers. They're an anti-government militia group. All of these groups have a history of violence, and interestingly enough, all three of these groups were involved in the attack on the US Capitol on January 6th. Very often what you see is that there's a convergence among these different groups. People who believe in one conspiracy theory, they're more likely to believe in others. People who are members of the Proud Boys are often supporters of QAnon, and there's often that interaction that occurs because of these underlying themes that are in common. They are essentially the same, they're slightly different expressions of the same underlying motives. So I want to talk about something else that we've seen lately in society here and around the world, and it's something that has been a very significant concern of mine personally as someone who is really concerned with our future. And that is this global rise in far-right nationalism that we've seen, not only in the United States, but around the world. And in fact, individuals who are members of these nationalistic groups, they're gaining support throughout the world in countries like Germany, France, Italy, Sweden, even Iceland has a growing faction of individuals who are nationalistic. Australia, even India is dealing with its own current struggles in terms of nationalism. And what we're talking about here is a kind of nationalism that's essentially unhealthy, especially on the world stage. Okay? And these groups are also very high in violence. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the research on this nationalism as a human phenomenon. What we see is that when people are reminded of their own mortality, even as in a pandemic, and when they're made to fear something, they more strongly defend those who share their own beliefs, and then they more often act out aggressively against those who do not. And specifically, this research has found that when you scare people or you remind them of something to be scared of, they're more likely to endorse anti-immigrant attitudes, and they're more likely to endorse conservative political values. And this brings us to the third force. And the third force that has a very, very robust effect on human behavior in pretty much any situation is fear. And the main way that fear operates is by reducing our sense of agency and control. It is that one motive that is affected most by fear. And this has two different effects that will help us understand things even further. The first is that it leads us to cling to our worldviews. Okay? It makes us cling to what we know and also want to assert our power and assert our agency because it has been compromised in some way. And very often we do that aggressively towards other groups of people. The second thing that it does is it makes us more vulnerable to manipulation. And I've added here misinformation because that's a way that we're manipulated online. Because what happens is that as we try to make sense of the world, okay, we're open to suggestions of how the world works. And furthermore, as we seek out safety and security in a state of fear, we're also vulnerable to other people who step in and try to show us the way. Okay? We're seeking safety and security, sometimes desperately, and sometimes we can't find our way back to the group. And what that might mean then is other people can step in and take advantage of us. So we'll take a closer look at each of these with some examples. On the first point, that fear makes us more easily manipulated as we try to make sense of the world. Well, this is a great explanation for how we understand the motivations behind conspiracy theory support. In the psychological literature, we actually see that people are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories in response to situations where they feel out of control. Right? And that again brings us back to this compromised sense of agency. And furthermore, people who believe that the world is dangerous are more likely to adopt conspiracy theory beliefs. Why? Because they give us a sense of order. However outlandish they may be, they give us a sense of order and security, and they make us believe that the world is not as random and chaotic as it might actually be, but instead it has some order to it. Okay? And this is a really important way of understanding why, even during COVID-19, we still see these conspiracy theories supported. It's a scary situation, and we don't want to believe that the world is as random and disordered as it actually is. And we want to believe that there's some kind of way of understanding it all. So that's really important to our understanding of conspiracy theories. If we look at the way that fear makes us easily manipulated in our search for safety and security, well, that's where we see fear play such a pivotal role in all of these different social movements that exist today. You know, when we look at Trumpism and supporters of the Make America Great Again slogan, uh, those individuals were driven by fears of Mexicans, Muslims, and immigrants primarily in the beginning. Now, it's not a coincidence that those fears were really massaged by the individual who was looking for the support. It's a very common tactic employed by more problematic leaders today and throughout history. If we look at QAnon, well, there are fears of the secret cabal of left-wing elitists running a child sex trafficking ring. But even more importantly, in QAnon, there is a belief that there's something in terms of the government and the country itself that is at risk by these elitists. So people are fearing the loss of their culture in some way. And when we look at Proud Boys or Incels, some of these other extremist groups or nationalist groups, there are all kinds of other fears that are seen to underlie those movements. Fears of, immigrants, fears of the loss of culture, the fear over the feminization of men, fears of liberals, etc. There's always a fear there underlying this because these groups are driven by that fear. Now, here's a really interesting thing that I want you to consider, and that is, what if we're alienated and disconnected to begin with? As I suggested to you, this tendency to be manipulated really comes from this vulnerability as we seek out safety in the group. But what if we have no group to go back to in the first place, as we might not in a highly individualistic culture in which we feel disconnected and isolated to begin with? What happens? We're even more vulnerable to these other groups stepping in and showing us the way, however problematic that path may be. The last thing that we see is that fear divides us. Okay? As our agency is threatened, we desperately cling to whom and what we know, and we're more likely to act out aggressively to other groups of people. And it's an attempt to reassert our power. And what happens over time is that walls are built, contempt grows between groups, and ultimately violence ensues. Okay? And the end result of this is that our broader sense of communal well-being as a society is sacrificed, or at least it's compromised in some way. You might look at these different social movements and you might think, well, maybe they're getting something out of it that is positive on some level. Maybe they're driven by their communal instinct. Maybe they're just looking for a sense of belonging. And it is true that they're looking for that. But I would argue that these groups do not offer an authentic fulfillment of the communal drive. And what I would suggest is that, in fact, they're giving sort of this superficial sense of belonging that's often based on image and external reinforcement, okay? And, other problematic outcomes that, don't really allow that communal drive to be satisfied in the way that it really needs to be. And in the end, the broader sense of communion in society is at risk. It's making us more divided. It's incongruent with the idea of society in the first place, at least the way that I would understand society. So this is, one of the more problematic outcomes that we see. But again, it can really be understood in terms of the effect that fear has on our sense of agency and how we feel threatened and out of control and how we want to try to regain that sense of control. All products, again, of a hyper-individualistic society. So let's talk a little bit about a path forward, since I don't ever like to leave on a depressing note in any conversation like this. I know it's a really big conversation. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on how to move forward potentially. I want to try to address this last point on two different levels. I want to talk about it in terms of the societal level and then the individual level. On the societal level, I think what is important to recognize is that a healthy society is one in which people feel safe, secure, and connected, not scared and isolated. Right? And this is a really important thing to understand, that that feeling of safety, an authentic sense of safety, is unbelievably paramount to a functioning society, and also that feeling of being connected. In a society that's hyper individualistic, our communion is being compromised, and that means we're not feeling as connected as we need to feel. So here's one key recommendation I think that comes out of that. And that is that we need to elect communally inclined leaders who are humble, not narcissistic, not driven by power, not driven by their own personal needs. Right? It's one of the biggest mistakes that we make all the time, is we elect leaders who sound good and look good and seem really dominant and have these big egos, but it's problematic for the operation of a government, which requires communion. And in the end, it requires looking out for other people. And very importantly, we need to elect leaders who are able to make people feel safe. And I have Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, as an example here, because I think she's a really great example of this. But here's why we know that safety is so important. If you recall, I talked to you about research that has found that when you scare people, okay, it makes them more conservative, it makes them more closed-minded, makes them anti-immigrant, makes them more nationalistic. And in fact, it actually makes them more authoritarian as well in their values. Here's what happens when you do the opposite. We found in psychological research that when you make people feel safe in a psychological study, okay, when you bring them into the lab, when you make them feel safe rather than scared, it actually makes them more open-minded. It makes them more pro-social. In fact, they're more likely to endorse very liberal social policies. In some cases, it made them indistinguishable from conservatives in certain studies. And it also makes them more pro-immigrant. They're more likely to endorse pro-immigration policy. Safety is a huge, huge factor, and it's essentially at the opposite end of fear. Okay? This is what leaders need to be doing. They need to be making their population feel safe, again, in a very authentic way. So what about the individual level? On the individual level, well, we can see that health is really dependent on balanced levels of agency and communion. And this actually comes from many, many different sources of research and many different areas of the psychological literature. We see a number of different lines of research agree with this conclusion, that a healthy person has balanced agency and communion. Nothing I'm saying today is suggesting that we need to completely abandon our agency. We are all agents. We are all individuals, absolutely. Okay? But we need to not allow that to become exaggerated. And I think what we need to do is we need to pay a lot more attention to our communal well-being. And so I'm going to suggest, although I don't know how concrete of a recommendation this is, it's a big one to put out there, but I'm going to say that we need to start valuing these communal traits like cooperation, compassion, and humility over individuality, power, competition, big egos, etc. Okay? Because we've really, I think, as a society, in our very competitive nature, in our capitalist and consumerist kinds of approaches to things, I think we've really fostered a set of social values that focus on individuality, power, status, and competition. And that's to our detriment in a variety of different ways, as we're seeing unfold today in society. The last point that I want to offer you is that we need to use our agency for purposes of communion. We are all agents. We all have power as individuals. But most of us, or at least a lot of us, use that agency to simply gain further agency, to gain further power. And the best thing we can do, not only for ourselves, but for the well-being of society, is we can use our agency for purposes of communion. We can use our agency to make a better world for ourselves. And the greatest minds in psychology have all gotten at this idea in some way, shape, or form, and suggested that it's not only a path to better individual health, psychologically as well as physically, but also to the health of society itself. So that's sort of the last recommendation that I'll leave with you. Anyway, that is all I have, but I would be happy to take questions. And I do have a list of online resources and recommended books that I put on my website because I couldn't fit them all on a slide nicely. So definitely take a look at those if you'd like.
Thank you very much, Dr. King. Just before we switch over to questions, if people could please take note of his website. Once again, it's thestateofus.net/1hour.pdf.
Thank you.
So we're now going into Slido questions. And once again, it's Slido and it's 1 hour, all capital letters, 0429 for any questions. And so our first question for right now is, would level of education be a factor for people involved in conspiracy groups?
So this is something that has been looked at in the research, and it has been found to play a role in some conspiracy theories, not all. Generally speaking, overall, people with lower education do tend to be more likely to adopt and support conspiracy theories. They've also found, though, that people who engage in less analytical thinking or critical thinking are also more likely to support conspiracy theories. The one that this hasn't always sort of panned out with is, interestingly enough, the anti-vaccine movement. So in the anti-vaccine movement specifically, which sometimes sort of looks like a conspiracy theory, in other cases it's not necessarily, and maybe that's why we don't see that consistent correlation. But in that case, education is not always a factor that we see in the research. But overall, yes, definitely it is. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question. How can an empathetic communal leader be accepted by agencies when they refuse to accept their legitimacy?
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, I guess, what we're getting at there is the possible incongruence that might exist between a highly communal leader and a society that's looking for people who are highly agentic and who are powerful. Here's something that I would sort of say in response to that, and hopefully this provides a little bit of insight. What I would say is that it's possible to be dominant and strong and confident while also being kind, compassionate, and empathetic. That these things don't have to completely negate one another. It's, I think, such an important lesson about leadership in general, that a good leader can be confident and self-assured and also compassionate and kind. And being a strong leader doesn't mean being, a narcissist. It doesn't mean being, a little more jaded or socially callous. And I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind that those two things can occur together.
Okay, thank you. So this one's been covered already in education. Yeah. There's another one. Are people who believe in conspiracy theories characterized by a lack in trust of people, or have they suffered from some form of abuse?
Okay, yeah, so I guess I'll address both of those different things separately. Yeah, I mean, I would say that overall, yes, that both of those things are factors. In terms of trust, I would actually, what I would actually do is I would suggest that trust in other people is also a manifestation of a more the communal drive. People who are higher in communion are more trusting of other people. When we see agency get out of control and what we might see in a highly individualistic society, what we actually see is that people become less trusting of each other. They're more socially callous. They become more paranoid in other people or of other people and their intentions. But, absolutely, it is definitely a factor in conspiracy theories. The anti-vaccine movement specifically has actually been found to be driven largely by a mistrust in the medical community. Now, why that is, why that it looks the way that it does, there are probably a lot of factors historically that might be relevant to that, but, it's definitely there. And generally speaking, individuals who follow conspiracy theories are more paranoid about what's going on in the world. Now, the other part of this question about, abuse, absolutely, if we see the more extreme end of that unmitigated agency, what we actually start to see are expressions of pathological narcissism and even psychopathy. Psychopathy is sort of the most extreme manifestation of that agentic drive. okay, at the complete expense of other people. Well, yes, we know that very often those kinds of traits or characteristics emerge as a result of early life trauma. I mean, the reality is, even psychopaths have a very, very high incidence of abuse and trauma in their childhood. So I would say that absolutely those kinds of experiences early on can make people more callous. They can make people, sort of more jaded and paranoid, and they can also make them take a more aggressive approach to their life. So, absolutely both of those things matter. Yeah.
Thank you. If you see someone engaging in sharing conspiracy type information on social media, is it pointless to engage? Is there anything we can do?
This is such a difficult question to answer, but I will give you something. My students always ask me this too, and it's I will just say that despite any advice I might offer, I've never been that successful myself in really getting very far with any of these conversations. But the reality is that there are certain ways to approach these conversations that can be more likely to result in a positive outcome, or at least the other person may be listening a little bit. And what we actually know from the psychological research too on many of these different conspiracy theories and even the anti-vaccine movement is that you never want to start off by attacking the other person's beliefs. That is the most problematic approach to this, because if you remember, the person is taking this approach in the first place because they're trying to assert themselves. They're feeling like their power is compromised. So they're not going to allow you to compromise that any further. They're not going to allow you to attack their beliefs and perhaps just, suggest that their, whole way of seeing the world is wrong. That's what they're most resistant to. So you can't take that approach. The only way that seems to be effective is to actually just provide alternative perspectives and information, where it's not about the person's beliefs, but it's about your other perspective. And that seems to be the most effective approach. In fact, when we look at the anti-vaccine movement and vaccine hesitancy more broadly, we see that when in psychological experiments, when we provide people with just alternative information, specifically about the threat of the diseases that they are being vaccinated for, that seems to be the best approach. If we just try to debunk their beliefs, if we try to take that approach, we don't get any kind of response. There's no change in perspective at all. So that's generally the kind of approach that I would recommend taking. But that said, I'm not necessarily going to recommend that you always engage either, because at least personally, I know as someone who's a little more sensitive, I think emotionally, it can be a very draining experience for me to go down those paths. And in fact, I go down those paths much less often than I used to. But depending on the situation, sometimes you can get somewhere. Yeah.
Thank you. So next one sort of ties in some of your comments, but takes it into a household setting. One parent is a conspiracy theorist, the other is not, and reducing conflict.
Yeah, I mean, what you really want to do ideally, again, is you always want to take that sort of that path that is the least perceived as an attack. That's always the best approach to take. Unfortunately, it can be difficult because when someone comes out with these ideas that seem really extreme or inconsistent with reality, it's hard not to react. But the best thing you can do is not react. And the best thing might be to simply share, alternative perspectives. I've talked to a lot of students who have dealt with, their parents, and some of them say that they get the farthest when they just provide alternative information, when they try to give them information. That's probably the best approach. But that said, there's no sure way of getting through, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. You touched on President Trump and sort of what was happening during his term a little bit in your talk, but can you elaborate a bit more? Why did there seem to be so many extremist groups coming to forefront during his term? Were they always there, but responding to a catalyst?
Yeah, I mean, it's I guess a complicated set of factors. What I would say is that the underlying motives that were perhaps triggered by Trump's presidency, they were absolutely there. Now, in some ways, to some extent in a population, they're always going to be there a bit. I mean, I think the people that really followed Trump and, the Make America Great Again slogan, they were people who were feeling isolated. And although it is not an accurate reflection of reality, I don't think. They were also feeling like their way of life was somehow being threatened. And Trump came along and told them what they were looking for. And he told them what they needed. And that really motivated them. I mean, furthermore, he reminded them of things to be scared of when, we know already that fear is a really motivating factor. The other thing, though, that comes up in all of this is that, in a hyper individualistic society where narcissism is perhaps a bit higher, what happens for those people who are narcissistic themselves in the general population is that when they see someone come along in a leadership role who is also narcissistic, it's a confirmation that the way they're acting is okay and the way that they're acting is acceptable, and it sort of exacerbates that behavior. And there are a lot of psychologists who have talked about this, how a narcissistic leader can just sort of bring out those qualities in a population in a really problematic way. No longer does the population feel that they have to hold back. No longer does the population feel like, that they're going to be experiencing some kind of repercussions as a result of acting in a even an aggressive way. And so it makes that kind of behavior more accepting. But I would absolutely argue that the ingredients were there. They were there. They were boiling under the surface. But the best thing, again, that could have happened is that you could have had a leader step in who made people feel safe. And I think, in contrast to Trump, Obama was probably a really good example of a leader in the U.S. who managed to make a lot of the population feel safer than what we saw during Trump's presidency.
Thank you. How much has social media played a role, if any, obviously, in different theories?
A huge role. I mean, it's just, as much as I'm a user of social media, I am also very critical of it. And, whether it's in terms of the psychological impact on people or the impact on democracy, I think social media has become a really problematic force in our lives. And the biggest problem with social media is that it reduces everything in a way that sort of makes it oversimplified. It takes out all the nuances in any kind of debate or any kind of conversation, and it makes everyone really focus on the superficial. And that means then that people are not really engaging in information in a way where they're going to get everything they need out of it. We also know in the research that people are more likely to become polarized on social media. So we have data now in the research showing that social media specifically makes us more divided. And I think the important thing to keep in mind with social media is that it is a very superficial form of communication. When we're in person with other people, there's body language, there's a smile, there are facial responses, and it makes it much more likely that people are going to agree or come to some kind of amicable outcome when they're together in person. Online, it's much easier to just continue disagreeing and to become angry and hostile in a way that you would never do in person. But on top of that, the misinformation and disinformation that characterize and litter Facebook and Twitter, that's a whole other set of problems that really makes these different social movements much more problematic. I mean, it contributes to vaccine hesitancy, as well as the emergence of these different subcultures that are quite violent in the end.
Thank you. So next question, why does an educated, intelligent, professional person, 65 plus, turn almost overnight to believe in conspiracies and not return to former mid-range views?
Okay. Well, I mean, I would say that, without knowing the person, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer without knowing the individual, but I would say that, to be honest, in thinking about the different experiences that I've had with individuals in my own life, I unfortunately have a slightly younger brother who's started to endorse all of these conspiracies. I have a parent who doesn't want to get vaccinated for COVID. What I've seen is that in all of those cases, there is something that they're really scared of. And there's this tendency to adopt all of this because they feel really disconnected and scared. And they may not admit that. And it may be hard to really get at those fears. But without knowing the person, I would guess that there's something underneath it all where the individual feels like they've really lost control, or that they're living in a really dangerous world and they're trying to make sense of all of that. Because I even though it might sort of manifest slightly differently in each person, I've still been able to sort of see that in everyone that I know who's taken up some of those more extreme beliefs.
Thank you. Next question. How do agency and communal mindsets relate to democracy?
Yeah, that's a really, yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons that I love this framework for thinking about human behavior and the human condition, because you can actually take it up to that level of thinking about different forms of government. And interestingly enough, if you think about the contrast between different systems of government, democracy sort of leans towards the more communal. And if we look at, countries that are more authoritarian in nature, and governments that are more authoritarian, or on the more extreme end, even fascist, they tend to adopt more agentic values. In fact, if we look at the early part of the 20th century, and we see the rise of fascism that occurred at that time, ultimately that was in response to rising democracy, and also communism and socialism, but it was in response to these more communal values that were emerging. And we can almost understand the politics that define the 20th century as being this sort of this mismatch, and this sort of I guess incongruence between agency and communion. And so you can definitely think about it on that level. Obviously within a democracy, depending on the political party, then we see values supported to different degrees. But it's worth noting that when we go farther to the right on the political spectrum, we see more authoritarian values, we see more nationalist values. Those all reflect agency. Okay? And the more liberal values that reflect equality and social welfare, they all reflect communal values. They're not all a perfect fit, but there's definitely that pattern there. Hopefully that sort of answered that question.
Thank you. Next question. What are the small, little, tangible things which we can do every day to improve ourselves and maybe impact people around us?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, well, I mean, if I'm thinking about the psychological literature as a whole, I think one of the things is to really be more mindful. And I'm not necessarily talking about mindfulness in terms of mindfulness-based meditation. I just mean being more mindful of the moments, and in our relationships in particular, being more mindful of those relationships. And I think that really would go pretty far in terms of fostering that communal well-being and that communal aspect of our lives, especially in the world that we live in today with our technology and social media. I think we're really missing out on a lot because we're not really allowing ourselves to enjoy that moment. The other thing I would say is to really make an effort to express gratitude, and to consider someone else's perspective as much as possible. Empathy is something that definitely differs among people naturally, but it's also something that we can practice. And I think it's really important to practice empathy whenever possible, and to listen to other people and not always have to be the one talking. That's I think maybe a specific recommendation I would make, that it would be really important.
So I'll tie that in with the another question.
Okay, sure.
The next one, actually, 2 down. Do you think
Okay.
there's the potential to become a more communal society in the future, or will we become more divided?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's not to be too dramatic about this conversation, but I think this is the challenge that's ahead of us. In my mind, the notion of society itself is one that is inherently communal. I don't understand what society is if it is not communal, if it's not an attempt at communion. And so we definitely need to do something about this. I do think that ultimately what is important to recognize in all of this is that as much as these drives do exist within us for different reasons, okay, and we're always going to be dealing with these differences that exist among us, what's happening in the world around us is also really important to all of it. And going back to that conversation about fear and safety, when you have a population that is not made to feel safe and secure, and when you have leaders who are not communally inclined, and they're stoking division, that's really problematic. And if I'm thinking about the best thing you can do practically, I really do think that it's a matter of electing people who are not defined by those characteristics. We are fooled too often by narcissists who take on these political roles and leadership roles, and who, give us this facade of this strong, powerful leader, but who actually don't care at all about the well-being of society itself. And they're in it for personal gain. And I think one of the best things we can do is start recognizing those qualities. We have a lesson in this from the last 4 years. Okay, we, witness these characteristics in a leader on a regular basis. We know what they look like. And almost all problematic leaders throughout history, all authoritarian leaders and despots and dictators, they all have the exact same traits. Psychologists have talked about this for years. They all have narcissistic traits, antisocial traits. And the best thing we can do is recognize those before those individuals are allowed to take on those leadership roles. Our leadership is really pivotal to moving forward in a more communal way, I believe.
That ties in to the next parts of the next question. How about changes to our education system? What kind of changes do you think would help? And how can we push our politicians to take action to include those changes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the things that I think we, need to see, and I don't know, there'd be some steps, I guess, in getting there, but I think we definitely need to see a little less focus at times on competition. I'm not saying that all competition is bad or unhealthy, but I think we need to really do that. And I think we also need to really overcome a lot of different assumptions and biases that continue to persist in education when it comes to gender. Because I would actually argue that, one of the best ways we can move forward to go back to that last question too, one of the best ways we might be able to move forward is to also have more women in government. That's not assuming that you could never see a female psychopath. Of course you can, but we actually see evidence of this again in the research. In fact, there's Canadian research that shows that over time, the more women that you have in government, the better society is as a whole in all kinds of different outcomes. And so a lot of this might have to do with showing girls early on that they can be good leaders too, and not seeing all of these really harmful qualities enter those leadership roles. So that might be something else in education that can happen. And overall, I think if we can somehow remind children, whether through parenting or education, that there's something to really value in humility, that it's a really valuable trait, it's a strength, it's not a weakness. I think that too is something that would really go a long way.
Thank you. We're almost at 2 o'clock. Are you able to take a few more questions?
Sure.
Dr. King?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Thank you. What is the correlation between economic factors and conspiracy theorists?
Interesting. Well, what we do see is that certain conspiracy theories are related to lower income, but not as consistently as we think. So the anti-vaccine movement, for example, is actually very often endorsed by people of very high income, often in neighborhoods where a lot of people, have access to different options in terms of healthcare, and they essentially have the privilege to sort of say, well, I don't want my children to be vaccinated. So we don't always see a consistent relationship there. But what we do see on the broader scale is that as inequality worsens, we actually see that there is greater endorsement in conspiracy theories, and there's greater tendencies towards narcissism and needing to stand out and assert your power and dominance. So a lot of the motivations that we actually talked about today, and a lot of the different sources of social division, are understood to also, at least in some way, be the result of greater inequality that exists in a society. And I don't like to really pick on the United States too much, but they're a good example of this. I mean, they have some of the worst inequality in the world. They're hyper individualistic, and this is where we're seeing a lot of these different sources of social division, arise. The more unequal we are, the less trusting we are of each other. And the more we're worried about how we assert ourselves, and the more we're worried about how we appear to other people. So on the broader scale, economic factors do play a role in all of these things. But again, on the individual scale, we don't always see, economic status, for example, correlated. So I'm not sure, what aspect of economics that was getting at, but hopefully that answered that question.
Thank you. Next question. What would agency mindset do if governments mandate vaccinations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. To be honest, I think that's one of the risks in mandating them, is that you're going to see even more of a reactive kind of pushback from a lot of individuals, and you might even see many different acts of violence. The fear of control is a really, really big one underlying a lot of these different things. And you see that especially when it comes to the anti-vaccine movement. A lot of this is really motivated by uh, that kind of fear of being controlled. What I would say is a better approach to all of this, and this again goes back to the value of a leader who makes people feel safe. The better approach is, rather than mandating things, to have as much conversation as you need to, in a way that somehow, and I think this is where you need to employ psychologists and all kinds of other professionals in communication. You need to really do whatever you can to get the population to actually understand things, and to actually gain an authentic faith and confidence in vaccinations. So it's kind of the longer route. Mandating things is the shortcut. The longer route that takes a little more work, but I think would be much more successful, would be to really try to inform and educate the population in a way that works, so that you essentially, in some way, convince them of the real value of this.
Thank you. Are people happier in more collectivist societies?
No, not necessarily. So this is a really good question. So one of the things that we know about, highly collectivistic cultures is that they're also higher in conformity on average. And of course, one of the problems with conformity is that, a lot of the differences that exist among people, right, whether it's in terms of sexual orientation, gender identity, other factors, is that those different expressions are not always, welcome, and in fact, often they're responded to quite negatively in more conformist societies. I think the answer to the individualism and collectivism conversation is that there is this healthy kind of cultural orientation, and psychologists have interestingly also studied this, that can be fostered. And what it looks like is an orientation where individuals do see themselves as individuals. So there is that value of individual differences and who you are as an individual, but they maintain collectivistic values. They maintain those broader values of society and of other people. And so it's almost like this healthy combination of individualism and collectivism. And it's in line with this conclusion that we're not saying that it's all about communion either. In the agency communion conversation, it's about a balance, right? And collectivistic cultures are a little more out of balance in terms of agency not being, at a healthy level. Individualistic cultures are unhealthy in terms of communion not being at a really healthy level. So we need to somehow find a way to meet in the middle. I think that's really what our path forward might look like if we were to imagine moving forward in a healthy way as a society.
Cute. We're now at 2:05 and we have a few more questions. Do you still have time?
Yeah, I'd be fine. Yeah, for
okay,
5 more minutes maybe. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
We all know contrarians. Are they predisposed to having an agency mindset? Why some and not others?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, definitely. I think it's absolutely a reflection of that drive. Definitely. It's sort of this way of asserting yourself and being a little more difficult sometimes in conversations. So, why some and not others? I would say that it really just comes down to, some of those things that exist, in our environments as well as our own biology. I mean, some of us are a little more driven in that direction than others. And I think it's going to take a while to sort of overcome a lot of that. But yeah, I think we live in a world really today where it's too easy to be that way in the end. I think that maybe is one of the biggest problems.
Thank you. Next question. Is the growth of fear related to lack of ability to understand and accept risk? Example, the realization that nothing is 100% certain?
Yes, definitely. Absolutely. Going back to that discussion about trying to make sense of the world. Absolutely, it's a matter of, there needs to be some acceptance that things happen in a way that, may not always be predictable, and that there is that kind of, risk. When we see people who are really, when we see people who are responding to these different threats or sources of fear, like a pandemic, in a way that, leads them to these more extreme beliefs, they're absolutely, not wanting to accept that that risk is out there, that the world is dangerous. They're wanting to believe that it's more ordered and that they're safer than perhaps they thought they were. So absolutely, I mean, I think a lot of this maybe comes down to an acceptance of reality and the way that things, really look. I think we all need to sort of be more accepting of the way that nature itself works, rather than always trying to make sense of it in an unhealthy way and in ways that are unrealistic in the end. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question. What level of accountability should the media news have when it comes to instigating fear in society for the sake of ratings or viewership?
I mean, first of all, they absolutely play a very significant role in it all. And that sensationalization, that sensationalized kind of approach to the media is very problematic. We know, again, in the research that, sensationalized media, that does have an effect on people psychologically, has an effect on their motives. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of responsibility there, absolutely. And if we're thinking about how to potentially change societal values to make people more communally inclined, somehow I think we do need to take a different approach in terms of the media. And we know that the media and the news, and pop culture in general, I mean, these things have influences on people from a very young age. And so somehow, I don't know if I have an answer as to exactly how that can happen. I think it's complicated, but somehow I think we do need to get, the media on board in terms of how to move forward more successfully. But again, we live in an individualistic society that's also capitalist and driven by money, and these are tough things to overcome, I think.
Thank you. The next question will be the last one. I know you're, as far as your time, really appreciate it. If you are a trusting and communally focused person, how can you safeguard yourself from the psychological sway of highly opinionated anti-vax family members?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, some of the things I guess I brought up were sort of relevant here too, but I would say, I'm someone, who is much more communally inclined and always has been naturally. I'm a very humble person, and it's taken me a long time to even, get this comfortable with, public speaking because of my humility. And I would say that sometimes, unfortunately, you kind of have to step away from it all, and you do have to really stop sometimes engaging in those discussions. And I don't want to ever suggest that, we all should stop engaging with people, who see things this way. But I know from my own experience that it can really wear on you over time. And, sometimes when you consider all possible outcomes, sometimes you're better off to just not even get into it and to avoid that conversation. I'm not, again, suggesting that we want to avoid all of these conversations. I think they need to happen in different contexts, but especially if it's a family member, someone that you're around a lot, sometimes you need to sort of swallow your pride and not get into it, because often what happens is that the more agentic people, the ones that are really driven by that need to assert themselves, well, very often they're relentless, and you're just not going to get anywhere in the end. And as someone, who's more humble, well, very often that comes with some greater sensitivity, and it can be really hard. It can be really hard. How you navigate all of this stuff is a challenge, absolutely.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. Really appreciate your time today. It's given us a lot to think about, looking at what's happening around us and trying to make sense of a lot of different things with different people and how they're reacting. And once again, I'll suggest that people, can you just mention your website again?
Sure, it's thestateofus.net. Okay. And if you go to thestateofus.net/1hour.pdf, you'll get the download for recommended readings.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who joined us today for the last of our 3 1 hour UBC lectures for this spring. Thank you very much, and everyone please stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.